Today, our health includes our mind, our body, and our spirit. Separating medical facts from fiction is the key that leads to wise decisions about our health and well-being. Unpacking the latest research is vital. Doing what works helps us live our best lives today. How can we live longer? How can we live healthier? Let's ask Dr. Walt on Liftable TV.
Dr. Koenig's research has been featured on many national and international TV programs, including ABC World News Tonight, The Today Show, Good Morning America, and NBC Nightly News, as well as hundreds of national and international radio programs, newspapers, magazines like Reader's Digest, Parade Magazine, Newsweek, and Time. And Dr. Koenig has given testimony before the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives concerning the benefits of religious involvement on public health. And he's also the lead author of the Oxford University's Handbook of Religion and Health, which he authored with two Harvard professors. And most important to me is that we're both family physicians, as Dr. Koenig was formerly boarded in family medicine. So Harold, welcome to Ask Dr. Walt.
Thank you, Walt. It's great to see you again, and I'm excited to be on your show.
Well, we've got so much to talk about, but I have a little surprise for you because I want to show our viewers where we met. And it was actually in this book. There we go. The Oxford University Handbook of Religion and Health. This was the first edition. You've also authored the second edition. First edition, 2001. Second in 2012. And now the third edition is coming out, what, next year?
Yes.
And if you want a skinny book, this book's not for you. But the reason I'm showing you guys at home this is because Dr. Koenig co-authored with David Larson. David was one of my psychiatry professors at Duke when I was in residency. Then he went from there to the National Institute of Mental Health, and then the National Institute of Healthcare Research. And Harold, it was Dave, our mutual friend, who introduced me many years ago into bringing faith into practice. And I know we both love Dave Larson.
We do. I knew Dave very well, and he was a real inspiration for me also.
You know, back in Dave's day, he was, I think, one of the first to point out that in the psychiatric literature, for example, the psychiatric coding books, many of the examples of crazy people, of psychotic people, were religious people. And that was kind of the coding book. On the other side was the literature showing, gosh, there's a very strong faith-health connection, and it's actually positive. Remember those days with that dichotomy?
I remember those. And, you know, I think it really had to do with the influence that Sigmund Freud had on the entire field of mental health, but particularly psychiatry, as a psychiatrist himself, in his negative views towards religion, part of which resulted from his own past childhood experiences, as well as the kinds of patients that would come to see him that might often be turning to their faith to help them to cope, and his misinterpretation of what that was all about.
How did you first get interested in that faith-health connection? Because you've wandered through a lot of the spheres of health. Where did that connection occur?
Well, you know, I'd been a nurse prior to becoming a physician, and then I was a family physician and would go on rounds seeing patients, and I had been taught kind of as a nurse to ask patients about how they were coping. So I would continue to do that as a family physician, and I heard so many times people mentioning their religious faith in terms of how they were dealing with their stroke or their heart attack or the disability they were having or their pain. It was through their religious faith, prayer, their faith community connecting with them and encouraging them, their pastor. So I was struck by that because that was, as you know, well, that was not part of any of our medical training, nor was it part of my nurses training either.
And how did you get from that recognition? Because you must have wondered, are these people crazy? Are they nuts? Or is there something here? How did you then decide to kind of look into that a little bit?
Well, in medicine, we're always taught to, go by the research that people are reporting in peer-reviewed journals. That's how, that's how education within the healthcare sciences moves ahead. So I thought, well, my observation is that these individuals seem to be doing quite well despite the enormous stress that they're under, particularly those, with a strong religious faith. So I thought, why not document this in a systematic way? Because, my colleagues were not real excited about, my views there. But I thought, well, if we use the methods of science, maybe we could document in a systematic way how common this is and what impact this has on a person's ability to cope and their mental, social, and ultimately physical health.
As you look back literally across the centuries, because I think, gosh, in the book you talk about going back into the late 1800s and looking at the science and then bringing it all the way up till today, you describe not a small number of studies, but a huge number of studies that talk about, that look into this association between religious and spiritual health and physical, emotional health. How many are there now? You have even a guess?
Back in 2001, there were about 1,200 quantitative studies of that type. Now, not all showing, the benefits of faith, but the majority of them indeed demonstrating that. By 2012, there was about 2,400 quantitative studies. I believe about 2,400, may have been 1,600, but I can't remember exactly. Mm-hmm. But today, if you Google, on Google Scholar of religion and health, you will find tens of thousands of reports, not all quantitative, but many are quantitative. So there are probably at least 3,000 quantitative studies looking at this connection published in peer-reviewed academic journals.
I think that's going to surprise so many of our viewers to know that, because there's so much emphasis in culture now about follow the science. And in fact, the science shows that there's not just an association between religion, spirituality, and health, but it's a strong association. And as you say, if I remember from the book, roughly 60 to 80% of the studies show a good association, a positive association, but then there are some negative associations also, correct?
Yes, probably about, particularly with regard to mental health, you find that a good 75%, at least 2/3 are finding associations with better mental, social, and behavioral health. With physical health, it's not quite as much. It's probably a majority, but probably closer to 50% of the studies are finding the association there. Part of it has to do with the complexity of the relationship, because religious involvement has to influence physical health through mental, social, and behavioral health. It doesn't influence it directly. So that weakens the association to some degree.
So what I hear you saying then is that we're whole persons. We have mental, emotional, relational, spiritual health. But in the science, there's been critics who have said, well, this thing that you're talking about, Dr. Koenig, this religious, spiritual positivity, isn't really that. It's actually just because those religious people are in social groups, or they don't smoke, or they don't drink. But in fact, the literature's been able to kind of dissect that out, hasn't it?
Well, they have. And, that those are part of the mechanisms on how religious involvement does affect health. So it's affecting a person's social relationships. It's affecting their health behaviors. But that shouldn't discount it just because, religious people, because of their faith, are not drinking and smoking and have better relationships. That shouldn't discount it. That's the mechanism in part by which religious faith influences those health outcomes. So, that has to be recognized, because the critics have tried to explain it away by using that logic. But in fact, that's not true. That's not true that just because it's due to better social health, better behavioral health, and better psychological health. Well, that's why it's related to better physical health. That's simply not true. That's the mechanism by which religious involvement affects a person's health over their lifespan.
I remember I was doing a program on Fox Health back in the 90s. It was called Ask the Family Doctor. It was an evening primetime show. And Dave Larson came down from the National Institute of Healthcare Research to do a show with me. And so he had just published a study looking at church attendance and how people who attended church tended to have better health outcomes. But he also looked at their risk factors, like did they smoke or whatever. And so this particular study was looking at the impact of church attendance on high blood pressure or hypertension. And so I challenged him. I said, well, Dave, isn't it just going to church that's helping the pressure? And he said, no. We said, we actually looked at smokers and non-smokers and church attendance or non-church attendance. And we found out that smokers who went to church had better outcomes. So he turned to the camera and he said, so if you're smoking, you need to get your butt in church. Now, he was just joshing, because I don't think you or I or anyone would say, hey, look, spirituality, faith is something you use. It's something that you turn to have better faith. We don't recommend it that way, do we?
No, we don't. In fact, the health benefits of religious involvement are really, in many respects, unintended. Because people who seek out religious involvement, religious faith, religious practice, for religious reasons, those are the individuals that are benefiting from it. So you can't just be intending to lower your blood pressure by going to church. It may, in fact, raise your blood pressure here, the kind of lifestyle that you should be living. So
it may depend on the type of sermon that you should. Also, last week I saw a guy with a shirt. It had a pastor, like in a cleric, like a cloak, and it looked like he had a Bible. The dog had a Bible over its paw, and it was shaking its paw at the congregants, who were all dogs, and they were kind of cowering back. And the little caption said, "Hellfire and Dalmatians." And so, anyway, I had a guy in the office, maybe a month or so ago, and I always take a little spiritual assessment with patients, and I want to come back to that just in a second. But I was asking him about, was faith important to him or not? And he said, yes, it was extremely important. And I said, do you have a faith community that supports you, that you attend? And he said, I go to church all the time. And I said, how often? He said, well, every Easter and every Christmas, I'm there all the time. And you've pointed out the difference between an extrinsic spirituality, an extrinsic religiousness, and an internal. Explain that to our viewers.
Okay. There are two types of religiousness that were described by Gordon Allport, a psychologist at Harvard, in the 1950s, actually. He would go to church, and he would find people there that were in church for extrinsic reasons. They were there in order to look good, to generate business for their company. They might be there only to connect with people, for dates or whatever, to find a nice looking spouse of some kind. So there were other reasons other than religion that they were in the church. Now, on the other hand, there were people also there that were there for religious reasons, that it was there to grow in their faith, to learn more, to connect closer with God. Those individuals he described as intrinsics. They had a level of religiosity that was considered to be intrinsic. In other words, it was religion that was their master motivator for being in the religious services, whereas the other people, the extrinsics, were there for some other reason other than religion, and were using religion to achieve some other more important end.
And the intrinsics were the ones that actually have the benefit.
That's what the studies have shown, that it's the intrinsic individuals who have the most health benefits. And in fact, some of the extrinsic religious participants actually had some worse health outcomes. Now, they haven't all shown that, but they have one consistent finding is that intrinsic religiosity is one of the key factors related to health. And for the last 35 to 40 years, that is the way I've tried to measure a person's religiosity and connect it then to their health outcomes.
It reminds me of that verse in the Bible where Jesus says, "Behold, I stand at the door of your life and I knock. If you invite me in, I will come in and have a relationship with you. And if you don't want to, that's okay. That's okay too." But it's almost describing an extrinsic becoming an intrinsic when their faith internalizes. Am I reading that right?
Yes, that's exactly what happens. The sad part is that many extrinsics, don't turn into intrinsics. And, unless you keep your spiritual life, it's easy to turn from an intrinsic into an extrinsic.
Got it. As I looked at what you've written, I see that some of the positive benefits of an intrinsic spiritual faith include some preventative impact, some longevity, some length of life impact. But it seems to me, seeing patients now for the last 40 years, that the real benefit of that internal faith is the ability to cope with difficult diagnosis, with difficult relationships, that faith gives you a way of navigating difficult waters. Do the studies show the same thing?
Yeah, Walt, when I first got started in this area, it was indeed the coping that I was fascinated by. Our first studies involved going to the bedside of patients, older patients at that time, although also some younger patients, asking them how they were coping with their physical condition. And what we found is that, depending on the location, and it varies depending on where you are in the U.S., but we found that at least in the southeastern U.S., up to 90% of patients indicated that they were using their religious faith to at least some degree, and 40%, almost 1 out of every 2, indicated that religion was the most important factor that enabled them to cope of all things that they had done. More important than the doctor, the medicine, the nurse, their family, it was the most important factor. So, that's what really impressed me. I thought, geez, if this is the most important factor, then this must have some kind of benefit on their health.
Well, you certainly have shown that with your writing and your speaking, literally around the world. We talked earlier about spiritual assessment, of how now quality care organizations, the Joint Commission, for example, some of the cancer associations are saying that physicians, nurses, healthcare professionals should do a spiritual assessment of their patients. In other words, to find out what our patients' deeply held religious beliefs are and how they're going to impact their decision making. So even atheist or agnostic physicians should be doing a spiritual assessment. Yet I find most of the patients that I see have never had a healthcare professional ask them about their spiritual or religious health. Where do you see that transition? Are doctors and nurses getting better at finding and meeting the needs that people have when they're sick? Or are we still kind of standoffish as a profession?
Well, Walt, I think that in general, we are still pretty standoffish. Back maybe 10, 15 years ago, only about 1 in 10 physicians took a spiritual history on a regular basis. And that included oncology patients, patients who were dying. And nurses were not doing all that much better either. There is this fear that, that they would be seen as, proselytizing patients or somehow, trying to influence them at a time when they were vulnerable. And many doctors and nurses were trained to separate out their own religious and spiritual beliefs from their practice. So those were two lanes that were kept pretty separate. So now with increasing medical schools that are teaching the need to, address the spiritual issues, if only briefly, as part of a new patient evaluation, we're seeing that increase, but it's still not any more than 50% at most, probably closer to maybe 25%.
I've had the privilege of teaching in hospitals around the country and teaching medical staffs how to do a spiritual assessment. And they always ask, well, why? And I say, well, it's because research has shown that people will have spiritual needs when they get sick. They start thinking about eternity. They start thinking about spiritual things. And we don't necessarily answer those questions, but we can connect them with pastoral professionals in their faith community or chaplains or people who are there to give them help and hope in the midst of difficult situations. And Harold, your research, I think maybe there's only 50% of us that are doing that, but a lot of us can attribute that to what you've done, and we're grateful.
Well, thank you, Walt. I appreciate that. It is the research that drives clinical practice. That was what I recognized early on in my career. And, I think there are many healthcare professionals who themselves have a religious faith. And that is probably one of the reasons why they went into medicine and nursing, was because of that. It's just that, the training has kind of driven it out of them, or it's because they don't see the connection between their own personal faith and the patient's health. And the research has really been helpful in showing that connection and kind of overcoming that barrier.
Well, another thing you've shown is that the vast majority of patients aren't in any way offended when a healthcare professional asks them about their spiritual journey. They don't necessarily want you to push yours on theirs, but they're very interested in telling you about theirs, and then you can help connect them with people that can facilitate that journey and make it more fruitful.
Exactly. As healthcare professionals are so busy now, we don't have a lot of time. There's no question about that. But we see every single patient that's coming in, to the clinic or to the hospital, and there's an opportunity then to identify the spiritual needs of patients, if only by one or two questions. How are you doing spiritually? How's that part of your life going? It doesn't take much time, and patients really appreciate a doctor or nurse that connects them at that level. And that can really be a great way to identify areas of that person's life that are directly affecting their physical health and their medical outcomes. And then connecting them with, as you said, a chaplain, or, the chaplain is really the person who's trained to address these issues. And I would encourage, everyone to refer patients, when they identify spiritual needs, to a chaplain, unless they are very simple needs. But, there are a lot of simple spiritual needs that we could address too as healthcare professionals.
Absolutely. Well, our time's gone, Harold. I'd love if you would come back, because your expertise in mental and behavioral health, I'd love to talk a little bit more about the impact of spiritual health on emotional and behavioral health. Would that be something you'd be willing to do?
Absolutely. That would be fun, Walt.
Well, love to have you back, and I'll join you in rooting for those Duke Blue Devils this year. Well, before we close the show, I want to tell you about a couple of books I've written on whole person health. Fit Over 50, Make Simpler Choices for a Healthier, Happier You, and 10 Essentials of Happy, Healthy People, Becoming and Staying Highly Healthy. In both of those books, I talk about this connection that Dr. Koenig has taught me between spiritual health and physical emotional health. You can find those books at drwalt.com. Just click on the tab that says books. Also at drwalt.com, you can sign up for my daily medical news you can use blog and my twice daily biblical devotion called Morning Glory, Evening Grace. Now, if you have any comments or questions about this program or any other program, drop me an email at drwalt@liftable.tv. That's drwalt@liftable.tv. So until our next visit, dear friends, I pray that you may enjoy good health and that all may go well with you, even as your soul is getting along well. I'm Dr. Walt Larimore, and I look forward to seeing you on our next episode of Ask Dr. Walt.